Welcome to the New Monastics Podcast, where we'll be discussing all aspects of the contemplative life and interspirituality in the context of modernity. On each episode, we will choose a topic to explore with one of today's leading teachers or thinkers. The New Monastics Podcast is a project of Charis Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality, which is dedicated to the emergence of a newly conceived contemplative life of embodied spirituality and sacred activism. Welcome to the New Monastics Podcast. I'm Nathaniel, co-founder of Charis Foundation and dialogue partner for our guests.
And I'm Daniel, the host for the show.
Today, we've invited back our friend Ramon Parish for an exploration of radical futures, a look at how we might reorient our present to facilitate our future. Ramon is Associate Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Naropa University and works on climate justice initiatives with his wife, Michelle Gabrieloff-Parish.
Welcome. We're so happy to have you back on the show.
All right. Good to be here. Thanks for having me back.
So Ramon and I are working on the idea for a class called Radical Futures in Sacred Activism. And we're hoping to talk about, a number of related issues, everything from what you might call ethno-spiritual futurism, the impacts of media on consciousness, evolutionary and sacred models of human development and maturity, and how societal transformation can be approached from a sacred perspective. So I want to start, Ramon, just by asking you, I know how I came to be interested in these things, but how did you come to be interested in the kind of futurism we're both talking about now?
Yeah. I think I've been interested in futurism in a really broad way, at least since 18. And I think just the questions about the relationship between technology and culture, science and religion, technology and art, even sometimes technology and magic, if you want to throw that in there. These were like kind of old, just philosophical questions that I was just hosting. And then I think specifically, in the late 90s, I started to listen to Sun Ra. And through him and then through people like Paul Miller, DJ Spooky, and guys like Greg Tate, African-American literary critic, music critic, and I kind of came through them across the term Afro-futurism. And, even before the existence of the term, I think it was coined in the early 90s, people like Sun Ra and even W.E.B. Du Bois was writing science fiction from an African-American perspective. I would say Sun Ra was living science fiction from an African-American perspective. And so, I kind of got into Afrofuturism through those folks. And then in 2019, we started to, Regina Smith and I, one of my colleagues, our colleagues at Naropa, we started to teach an Afrofuturism class at the university. And a big inspiration in that class was Rashida Phillips out in Philadelphia is part of this collective called Black Quantum Futurism, sort of like this branch of Afrofuturism. And they're really looking at like the ways in which quantum physics shows that time is a little bit elastic and that some traditional African time concepts, particularly out of Kenya, have a similar kind of map about time. So I think my gateway into the sort of spiritual futurism in the most like concrete way was through Afrofuturism, basically saying, how can Black people specifically, but how can, many peoples bring some of their traditional philosophical, religious, and cultural principles to digital technologies, to electronic technologies, to science fiction themes like space travel and life extension and blah, blah, blah. What does it mean for a culture that has recent historical experience, like being used as robots? What does it mean for that culture to look at things like, artificial intelligence and the phenomenon of like, you've seen Tesla's new, like these robots walking around. It's like, what are they doing? You're having them do housework, right? You're having them do work that until recently in this part of the world was something that, Black people were forced to do. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, the whole iRobot thing.
Yeah. Exactly. And a lot of these future tropes that I think, authors and really even like investors who are coming from a more Eurocentric and unquestioned Eurocentric point of view. And from Afro-futurist lens, some of these things are like, they're not givens. It's not a given that we're going to make a robot. We're like, actually, what are we doing here? And what are we extending here?
Yeah. A few years ago, my wife Jamila started showing me some kind of radical art on the phone, and it was Muslim art, but it was Muslim futurist art. And there would be like a Kaaba in space. The ship had a Kaaba attached to the top.
Mm-hmm.
And there were ideas like that. And I thought, well, that's fascinating because right now on the planet, Islam as a tradition kind of has a problem. In the 7th century, the rituals were established for Islam, and it was these 4 days once a year people can go on pilgrimage and circle the Kaaba. When your population is small, that's not that big a deal.
Mm-hmm.
But that's 4 days in time in the fastest growing religion in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so that bottleneck gets tighter and tighter every year for the fastest growing religion in the world. It brings up certain critical issues. What about when we're in space, when our pilgrimages are like we're on other planets? I know it brings up fascinating issues of how to solve the problems of traditions. One Sufi mystic was actually accused of wanting to destroy Muslims' devotion to doing the rituals at the Kaaba by proposing that Kaabas be set up in other regions around the planet and people circle them there. And so it's sacred time, sacred space, and, how are we going to do these things? So I think, the issues of a futurism are really, it can seem like some sort of fantasy speculation, but it's really about addressing the problems of the present in which we can feel where they're going. We already have indications now of what's going to be put upon us in terms of challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of jump off points from there. I really feel like after the pandemic, we've entered the 20th century proper, the 21st century, wherever the transition period between the last century and this one. I feel like it was this first 20 years of the 2000s. And in 2020, it's like, okay, we had this massive expansion of like this form of communication, right? And people who were like coordinating and using Zoom and other type of platforms, where it was happening before, but it wasn't like mainstreamed. And we're seeing like people talked about artificial intelligence until 2003, 2004, 2005. You were only talking about it in a science fiction context or in a like speculative capital context. And then at some point, 2016, we started hearing on NPR, this is powered by AI. And it's like, we just say, oh no, it's a thing. It's a thing now, We're saying a general artificial intelligence before 2030. And so I feel like we're seeing a lot of like the infrastructure that was previously thought of as, in a science fiction way, going back to at least the 40s, we're seeing that infrastructure actually be set up now. So like a lot of these problems that were anticipated and questions that people had around science fiction in the last century, they're now in our face.
Yeah.
And it really is the now. And then all you have to do is just feel a little bit into the now. And, if there's going to be a widespread virtual reality, if everyone, or not everyone, but many people are going to have artificial intelligent assistants, like what social impacts is that going to have? And like, what social impacts is that going to have beyond the like capitalist business world? You know what I'm saying? Like, not everybody in the world is living like this. Mm-hmm. Not everyone in the world wants to.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Like, if I think back, so many science fiction shows, in the last century were speculating about the 21st century. And they were all going to happen then, and it's funny now to watch some of those shows because it would be like 2018 and we're flying in spaceships and whatever. And we're not. Nevertheless, you're right. Post-COVID, something just clicked. it's just snapped into place, and we were in a different world where I was watching the Olympics this summer with my brother, and I don't really have TV, but he has TV on, and we're watching the Olympics and all the commercials, and like every commercial was for AI.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the commercials just blew my mind. It's showing an Olympic athlete, young woman, and there's a little girl watching her on TV, and she's saying to her dad, like, I want to be like her. And then the commercial starts like, with AI, your daughter can write her a letter. It's like, write the fan letter. Like, you meant
Right.
so much to me. And I thought, that letter written by AI for the child. And then they show, like the woman reading it. And I'm like, that will mean jack all to her. That will mean nothing to her. Because the only thing that would be meaningful is the child's scrawl and struggle to express themselves. But now AI
Right.
can do it for you. And I
Totally.
thought, are they not aware of the irony of this situation? Everything meaningful would be in the genuine response, in the awkwardness of the
Mm-hmm.
response, in the
Mm-hmm.
naivete of the response. And that's just gutted and transmitted through a machine to do it for you better.
Mm-hmm.
And we see this, with student papers now. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if I ask any information-based question, a student can use AI to write a response for them. So I can't ask those questions anymore. What it's bringing up is a question for us about us. Who do we want to be? And who are we going to be if we don't use this responsibly? Because if we don't use it responsibly, we're going to get used by it. We're going to become something we don't intend. And so that's the question we have to be asking. What do we intend for ourselves right now, for the future?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a big deal. And the AI is so prevalent right now, we're going to miss the window if we don't start asking that question hard. It will be an established reality that something is substituted for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not anti-technology. That's just being aware of the power of the technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a parallel question to what you're raising, Nathaniel, is what makes us human, or what is quintessentially human? And as we go into the future, what has always been true for us, kind of what is essential about our humanity, and how do we hold on to that while continuing to develop and use technology, hopefully for positive ends, and avoid the disastrous ends that it could lead to.
Yeah. This is a big question. And that's the one I try to explore all the time now. What does it mean to be human? How do we protect that little flame?
Mm-hmm.
It's the thing I want to explore all the time now, kind of in every class that I'm teaching. What is it to be human? How do we not lose it? How do we do it together? How do we respect it in one another? Again, not anti-technology, because the technology is a fact. You just have to figure out how to live with it and how to use it well. And I'm interested in where we go too.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, in your Afro-futurism class, what do you and Regina, what do you have people reading and why?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're in the process of expanding it from a 1 credit weekend experiential to a 3 credit course, which we're going to teach next spring. And it's going to be more reading intensive, I'd say, when that happens. But some of the things we have been reading, we have read essays from this collective, the Black Quantum Futurists, Rashida Phillips. There's another person named Joy Komet who talks a lot about word and word magic and how different historical narratives are sort of like word magic or mythical utterances and stories that we follow or whose spell we're under. They kind of talk about different story narratives as word magic and also as like alternative timelines, right? So, like, what narrative timeline are you playing out? Is it yours? Is it one that is germane to your existence, or is it one that's hostile to your existence? We have them reading some of the work of Adrienne Marie Brown around like pleasure and pleasure activism. We sometimes have them read Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic as like kind of one of the founding sort of pieces around like this whole idea of pleasure activism that Adrienne Maree Brown's popularized. We have them watch films like there's a film called Pumzi, which is actually coming out of Kenyan director, whose name I'm forgetting at the moment. It's a short film. You can find it online. And I'll say too that some people differentiate between Afro-futurism and African futurism. Some people, like a lot of science fiction writers and creators from the African continent, are starting to have a more of an international voice, and they're like just looking at the difference in the diasporic African experience and the continental African experience, and the way in which sometimes the diasporic experience is tried to like kind of umbrella prematurely the entire like Pan-African futurist experience. So anyway, I just want to put that out there. And then what else are we reading?
Octavia Butler, I assume.
Yeah, we are going to be reading more Octavia Butler, but because of the length of the class, because so far it's been a weekend experiential, we don't really get into like novels per se. We've been reading poetry. Sometimes we read the poetry of people like Alexis Pauline Gumbs. Yeah, so we kind of create like a multimedia experience because so far it's been more experiential. There's definitely readings that are part of it, but it's also musical, it's also visual, and then we get into almost like a fashion aspect of it too, because we're trying to explore it from a lot of different angles. But we definitely will be reading Octavia Butler's novels, at least one of them in the Afrofuturism course, because a lot of it really came out of literature and science fiction literature movements.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I guess for me, a lot of what's driving me is, well, it's a question about who we're going to be. And it's also a question about will we survive intact? And the intact is important to me, and the survival is important to me. But a lot of what drives it for me is a kind of philosophy around evolutionary theory.
Mm-hmm.
And years ago, I read this statement by an evolutionary philosopher, Gerald Heard. And he basically said in a book called The Five Ages of Man, it was a book written in the 50s, he meant humanity. But he was basically saying that, we are in the first generations that can walk the floor of history, meaning like we can walk it like a long room, turn around and look back and see where we've been. And we're among the first humans that can turn around and look at where we've been and see a development. And he said, because of that, we can evolve consciously now, which was not open to people before. They were evolving somewhat accidentally. They couldn't see where they had been. But because we can see where we've been, we can make choices about how we want to evolve. That's fascinating to me. That's what just came up as you were talking about even fashion aspects of it. Like you can design a future, you can design a life, you can think about, so much of fashion happens accidentally. But now, we can look at fiction and say, well, why can't that be here? Why do I have to leave that on the other side of the movie screen? What's the difference? Why shouldn't I represent that here now? But I think that that's kind of light without kind of a deep question underneath it.
Mm.
Like people can get into the play of that. It's just like people that get into steampunk stuff, But if you get into the question about why not, and what does it mean to lead a meaningful human existence, then I think it's going somewhere interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think, between that kind of evolutionary philosophy and reading things like Dune, which look 20, 30, 50, 100,000 years in the future, and looking at, did we survive intact, and looking at human potentials, then I get really excited about those ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is one of the big questions. I mean, with this like increasing customizability of our environment, of the media streams and the data streams that we receive. And then I think this is, to me, is like one of the hugest questions of the 21st century is the fact that our bodies are actually now customizable or will be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like this is something that we were rocking with in the Doc Ock thing. It's like W.E.B. Du Bois said the question of the 20th century would be the color line. I don't have this fully articulated, but I feel like one of the biggest questions of the 21st century is going to be the line between what is and what is not our body. You know what I mean? Like even COVID brought that up. It's like if I'm breathing my own mist cloud of contagion and someone else is in my space, you know, like some people are like, well, it's my right to just like be in a mist cloud of contagion. And other people are like, no, the responsible move is to contain your freaking mist cloud. Your body's boundary and this other person's body's boundary are starting to overlap one another and you're impacting each other. Like, yeah, where do I start and where do you stop? And then when we talk about you get into like the Neuralink idea, right? That you're going to implant a chip and that instead of me using these headphones like this with a wire or having them in my ears, like all subtly, it'll actually be implanted into my brain. You know, that's an evolutionary threshold that like the historical precedent for that is it almost doesn't exist.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like maybe jewelry and like body modification happened in certain cultures in the past, but like now we are plugging in these like collective networks into our own nervous system. And so it brings up this question again of like, what does it mean to be human? You know, is human a certain biological formation? Is it certain attitudes, mental, cultural? And like, what does it mean when we can actually like change the design of our bodies? Like whether you're talking about genetic technology, whether you're talking about artificial and biological neural network interfaces, whether you're talking about nanotechnology. I mean, it's just this like crazy expansion of human power, right? And I say human power, but it isn't going to be so far the power of everybody. It's power that is, you know, it's military industrial complex power.
Mm-hmm.
But it still presents to all of us this question of like, what does it mean to be human? And in the past, like our spiritual and philosophical and cultural traditions have informed us about what makes a meaningful life, what makes a human life. And so one big question that I might put to you two is like, how can those traditions help us navigate this massive expansion in human power, this massive customizability of our bodies and our environments, or even the ability to actually have like a world of illusion? You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, you clap the thing over your eyes or jack it right into your nervous system. You can see anything you want.
Mm-hmm.
That's what people are building for. That's what they're investing in. That's what they're researching. So, yeah.
Even before that question, I just wanted to throw out, I recently read this book called Sapiens by this guy, Yuval Harari. And the kind of end of that book is very much looking at this question. It starts with looking at pre-Homo sapien humanoids, you know, and the diversity of humans that existed before Homo sapiens became the kind of only humans on Earth. And then theorizing about humans beyond sapiens. And a lot of it has to do with technology and how much percentage of a bionic person would make it so that all of a sudden it wouldn't be proper to characterize them as the same species.
Mm-hmm.
So short of like robots that are completely digital or technological, but like you're saying, once a person has fully bionic limbs and bionic brain and all kinds of implants that give them superhuman abilities from a sapien standpoint, that raises really complex and interesting questions. And he's citing different kinds of evolutions that are happening right now in terms of technology and just looking towards the future. And the future is now, as you're saying, like it is happening and it's happening really, really quickly. So the question that you're kind of posing without ethical and moral guidelines, which have so often been informed by religious and spiritual traditions, I think it can really easily get thrown off the rails. And part of the kind of modern landscape is looking towards moral and ethical complexes like, you know, generally humanism, that is looking at that in a more general sense outside of a specific religious and spiritual tradition. Or like the Dalai Lama wrote this book, Ethics for the 21st Century, trying to kind of put out some general principles that maybe we can all follow regardless of creed and basically a humanist thought experiment. I'll throw it to Nathaniel to really speak to it, but I think it's a great question in terms of what can our traditions that are religious, spiritual, magical contribute to this new age, and how might they need to be updated, have their software updated to match, right? Like before we got on, we were like having technological difficulties of needing to upgrade software so that we can use our recording platform. And it's like sometimes there's that sense that traditions without being upgraded aren't compatible with our current hardware. It's an operating system that won't necessarily run, but then maybe that's a problematic thought in and of itself, that maybe rather than the old traditions conforming to this new reality also has to conform to our older traditions, and again, like to that which is quintessentially human and what our most ancient ancestors knew in their bones and knew in their practices. And as much technology as we have now, it also seems like we've lost a lot of technology in terms of the ability to listen to the spirits in the trees and all this kinds of things, by which our ancestors did incredible things, found medicine by intuitive means, for example.
I think in addressing, this basic question, can our traditions help us? Part of my conclusion for me was that they're participating in the same problem. And so I didn't look to them to help us. As a religion scholar, I'm fascinated by religion, and I love talking about it, and I love talking about those historical traditions. But almost all of them, no matter how great you think any of them are, come post the agricultural revolution on the planet. They're products of the agricultural revolution. And one thing that's remarkably clear is that agricultural revolution 10 to 13,000 years ago changed us in remarkable ways, not all of them positive. And since all of those religions participate in that change, and most of our time on the planet is prior to them, I wanted to look at who we were as a species prior to the agricultural revolution. And that's what's exciting to me. I feel there's something about looking at us prior to that may have information that tells us how we're to survive post agricultural revolution, because we've been on a fast track, way too fast in some ways since then. And so the question for me is about the Homo sapiens. What is different about this human? And for me, it boils down to a question of which version of Homo sapiens are we going to be? If you think sapiens means knowledge, the knowledgeable human, but there's another interpretation of sapiens where it's about tasted wisdom. So are we going to be the wise human or the knowledgeable human? And I think that's the primary question for us, because in some ways, technology is only enhancing a human pathology. Ramon, you're bringing up like kind of a visual or, a V-suit interface, where you can feel as if things are happening to you. And so you can live in a projected reality, but we already do that. We already do that. We interface with our projections, and we project them onto the people around us, impressions, and then we interact with the impression. And then I just interact with you like that without ever getting to know you. And so I'm actually interacting with my projection. I don't know you at all. And since we already do that, I think that's what we have to deal with. And I think we've been dealing with this question, I like the example you used about, COVID, it's my right, whether it's diseased or not, to breathe it the way I want, And I think we've been doing that from time out of mind, like insisting on rights versus responsibilities. I think of, Muhammad Ali, what may be the shortest poem on record. They said, give us a poem. And he said, me, we. And the way he gave that little poem was creating an equivalency. But we're stuck in a competition between me and we thinking. And somehow technology is only exacerbating that too.
Mm-hmm.
Algorithms are driving us into a kind of picture of ourselves that only reflects, one track and then is feeding it back to us so that we become the thing,
Mm-hmm.
what we're choosing to look at, and where our eyes are going. And then it takes away diversity mind. Like I'm always trying to confuse the F out of the algorithms. Like I will choose odd stuff on purpose so that it starts showing me the diversity of my mind instead of the one track it led me down,
Mm-hmm.
with particularly sweet breadcrumbs.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's weird, sweet breadcrumbs. I don't know. I guess those are donut crumbs. But like something is being exacerbated. And I see it in our culture. It's like this competition between me and we. And I think these are old questions. And so I want to get back at like human potential. Are we going to be the wise human or the knowledgeable human? There's only health in one of those models. But our religions, products of the agricultural revolution, in some ways, a new mind was born and it had certain advantages, but it also brings up certain problems for us.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we've come to terms with what it means.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious if you know of or have been using in your classes, like, because, okay, if we look at our religions and the fact that they've come out of like post-agricultural revolution, what artifacts, what models do we have that can inform us about the pre-agricultural? And like, how might you be applying some of those models to what's happening now with yeah.
I think it's the indigenous, and we were fortunate enough. We talked about this before. The idea of divergence and convergence, where the kind of Western technological mind met the indigenous again on this continent and in Africa, with disastrous consequences, but also remarkable opportunity for us to witness two versions of the human.
Mm.
The one that lived a relational spirituality and one that lived a kind of structured, organized spirituality. And I think relationality is the key to the indigenous. Everything is talking, everything is listening. If you think that way, even where we're sitting in offices and whatever, everything is talking, everything is listening.
Mm-hmm.
That's an amazing consciousness. And I think it could save us.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the primary thing.
Mm.
Well, and just to throw out, I think it's important in this conversation around the agricultural revolution, just to complexify that, because not all peoples and all places went through that at the same time.
Mm.
And so, even until quite recently, we had people who maybe utilized some amount of agriculture, but lived a completely different life, like lived a nomadic lifestyle, for example, that is very different than the kind of sedentary field working life that the agricultural revolution brought about in a lot of different places, like in the Americas and in Europe and whatever, but it didn't happen in a monolithic way. And I think it's those cultures that existed in a very different way until relatively recently, where we have the most information of a different kind of lifestyle and mind. And another book plug is I also recently read this book by Michelle Gabrieloff-Parish, The Sacred and the Profane, where the main thesis is this juxtaposition between the sacred way of living and mindset of more ancient peoples compared to the profane kind of modern view. And a lot of the examples there are peoples who have had agriculture and some of these traditions that are coming out of that, but a lot that aren't. And looking at different kinds of connecting points in terms of what tends to be true across a lot of different cultures. Like, for example, a concept of sacred time, which rather than the Judeo Christian historical sacred time of a God manifesting through history, sacred time consistently being a hearkening back to a primordial origin point and reenacting what the gods did to create the universe and to terraform the land, and humans as a microcosm of the universe participating in that sacred reality that is outside of history. And so to throw that into the mix here as we're looking at the kind of evolution of history, might it be helpful to bring in that sense of that which exists outside of time and a kind of sacred beginning that is omnipresent? Like, for example, in this book, they're talking about a common idea across peoples of the new year being a new beginning of the world. You know, that the world is being created anew in this kind of divine image. And so this hearkening back not to a previous time, but to a space-time of sacred origin that exists outside of time and space.
Yeah. One thing it's bringing up for me is just the tension that's existing between postmodernism and its kind of insight into incommensurability. And so that's like the individualism, radical individualism, like so radically individual that in some sense we could never meet. That's one of the dominant views out there right now. And, you can see parallels to a kind of jingoistic American individualism, that's connected to that. And there's a truth to radical incommensurability. Down in the nuance, you don't know that anything is the same. And I think that that's important. But as a view by itself, it leads to despair. And it's also, as an absolute, incorrect. On the other side, we have radical interdependence, which is absolutely true also. And so we have these two things competing, but they're both overlapping and true at the same time. And I don't know that we've really dealt with that. That's the me-we again. In some ways, that postmodernism is winning on a lot of different levels, whether people, know to call it that or not. In some ways, even though it's a really very powerful insight, it's acting like a pathology on the planet.
If you're enjoying the episode, please consider subscribing to our Patreon to help support the production of the podcast.
Subscriptions begin at $1. All patrons receive access to bonus content, curated resources, and exclusive patron events, including live Q&As.
For more information, please check out the Patreon link in the show notes, and thanks for listening.
And Ramon, you've been asking us the questions.
Yeah, you're the guest, man.
Yeah, so what do you think of all of this?
Again, there's just so many different directions to go. I think one of the major movements, I'm not sure if I'm answering any question that I put out there. I'm not, I don't even know where I am exactly.
No, more just what does all of this bring up for you? Kind of what are the thoughts?
So I think one of the major things that happened in the 19th and 20th centuries is that, because basically colonization, first you had Christianity, then you had modern materialistic science, empirical science, and then in some cases, maybe even like things like dialectical materialism. They went around the world and they basically said, the thing that we're doing is the only true form of knowledge. Mm-hmm. And all your religious histories, all of your spiritual stuff, all of your magical stuff, all your cultural practices, it's all based off of wish fulfillment, right? Isn't that sort of the theory?
Mm-hmm.
And then I think you kind of have this way in which an evolutionary view of history and historical transformation tried to supersede the spiritual views. For example, the view that behind the phenomenal reality, there are these archetypal realities where like the beginning is always accessible, and that a lot of our like ancestral and kind of magical traditions, if you wanted to really alter the phenomenal reality, you reached into the archetypal reality to try to alter it.
Right.
Or that the phenomenal reality would slip off of the archetypal reality and that the point of magic in a way was to realign the phenomenal reality with the archetypal. Like you don't change the archetype, you change the phenomenon by realigning it with the archetypal, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But the modern point of view is basically that like you got your humanist point of view and then you got your like post-humanist point of view, right? And the humanist point of view is like, well, all of those traditions were engaged in different forms of wish fulfillment. And then the post-humanist view is, and the way that we're going to actually get our wish to have magical powers, to be able to walk on water and be over here and there at the same time is through technology. And so there's a way in which the myth of technology has tried to completely supplant the other myths of human evolution, whether it's the biblical type of historical, we're going to see God through history, or whether it's the archetypal, like it's the new year, it's time to go back to the root structure of reality and then bring that back out culturally and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I think that's one of the things. There's actually a different religious philosophy that we're competing. I don't know if it's competing, but that we're striving against, which is this philosophy that technology is going to make the primordial dreams of humanity come true. It's going to life extend us. It's going to extend our powers. It's going to make us be able to heal from crazy stuff. It's going to give us all these abilities to see and hear everything that's happening everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Transhumanism, right? So like you got that. And for me, I guess that's really where a lot of my basic questions lie is like, what is the reality of a lot of the mystical traditions of the past, like, or the present? Like, what were they real or were they wish fulfillment? And the thing is that we're going to get there through technology. I think that comes back to these questions I've been asking myself since I was 18. Like, is it magic or is it science? Or is there some kind of hybrid of both of those that we could start to imagine? Do you all ever listen to the podcast, The Emerald?
No.
Mm-mm.
The Emerald is a fantastic podcast. I'm forgetting the guy's name who puts it out, but he raised this question that you brought up, Nathaniel, around, we'll use the title, the word animism, of like, you're in a world which speaks back to you. You're in a relational world, and even the inanimate has being and has relationality, personality. And he brought that into relationship with like this digital world of like, you want a refrigerator, you get up in the morning, your refrigerator's like, good morning, Nathaniel. It's like your heart rate is at. You are hungry. You habitually eat eggs and da-da-da. You're like, it's like we're making all these devices talk and interact with us because like the modern disenchantment of the phenomenal world, like people still have the hunger for the enchantment and for the relationality. And so instead we've created this environment of inanimate objects that are linked and talking to us. So I don't know. I don't know if these are just things I'm like kicking around and wondering about.
You know what that's bringing up to me is like, we're talking about science and spirituality, and is there a difference? And people have made a hard separation between them. I don't make that separation at all. There's ways of talking about spirituality that is not spiritual as opposed to secular or scientific. I think that that's a childish way of talking about it. Brother Wayne Teasdale proposed that spirituality, the way he meant it, just meant a system that has mystery in it, meaning I can have all the science that I want. And if I understand science, it is as an ongoing exploration. It's reaching out and building models and exploring the mystery. And that's just not different than what any spiritual person is doing. So it's just exploration and different models of exploration. But what this has got me thinking is that when we tend to talk about science, we externalize it into external technologies, and the futurism is about how to exploit these external technologies or how we're going to be exploited by these external technologies. But in terms of human capacities, those are technologies too. And when I pursue a particular meditation technique, and I pursue it not for 5 minutes, but for an hour or 3 hours, it's interesting to observe. And, this is written into much literature, and there are many people that can compare results. You pass thresholds in consciousness where you feel shifts, you experience shifts. And it takes training to do that, to exploit these human capacities. And the technologies there are meditation techniques, consciousness amplifiers that exist within us, or things that we use to amplify that consciousness. I think this is why I like Dune. Frank Herbert there in that series of 6 books actually explored all the questions that we're talking about. One, they have a Butlerian jihad. The great law after the Butlerian jihad is do not make a computer in the image of a human mind. So that's what we're doing with the AI right now.
Idol worshiping, the graven image.
Yep. And so they've gone past that moment, and they've had a near catastrophe. And so everything that happens in that series is post that realization. And then what we see are the great capacities of the human. And they're all scientific from the perspective that we're exploring the inner worlds of human capacity. And so you have the Mentat school, where a person can become an almost computational genius, but it's a human developed thing. In relationship to the melange, the spice melange, you can enhance certain capacities, have breakthroughs in consciousness that lead to precognitions, and you can, control your heart rate. I mean, those are all things that we do with meditation already. And so I like that because it's looking so far out into the future where we've already passed this question and we're continuing to explore what the human capacities are. And I think that's super important for me as a spiritual practitioner. That's a lot of what's been behind how I've approached spiritual practice all along. It's like, what am I and what can I be and how can I explore the dimensions of what I am? And it keeps going deeper and getting more interesting to me. So I don't know, like I think we do this thing of science is external technology, but human technology, and how to work on our own consciousness intentionally. It's not getting left behind, but in public discourse, it largely is.
Yeah.
I think that's a big one for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's where the mysticism is.
Right. People have used the phrase, I don't know who came up with this, maybe it was William James, but it's like technology is a democratization of mysticism. Because it's kind of like, okay, in different spiritual traditions historically, and I'm making really big generalizations, and if we want to get more granular and precise, like, it's definitely not postmodern to make giant generalizations. But like, let's say in like Ifa, the deal is you're in communication with the gods. In some ways, you are the outpost of particular deities, you might even say, or particular ancestral streams. Like, you're on Earth in a mediation relationship between the living or the seen and the unseen. And that becoming skillful at that, becoming cool in that, that's how you denote, like, this is a human life that's well lived. Okay. And so, like, our different traditions put forth basically, like, this is the human life that's well lived. This is how you relate the visible and the invisible. Right. So one thing is like, how do we maintain those questions and those inquiries in this day and age where there's so much transformation of the external environment and so much focus on external technologies? Like, in historical spiritual sense, that relationship between the visible and the invisible and the human, what's our role in that? How do we live a good life in those terms in this kind of world? I think that's one question. And then the other question is, again, basically the technological thesis at this time in the colonial, post-colonial world in the Western scientific tradition is, and even the cognitive science guys are basically trying to say there is no mind. There is only neural network, and that consciousness comes out of neural networks. It does not precede it. It can't exist apart from it, so on. And so they're like, there's only neural network. And then their bid for immortality of the soul is to replicate the human neural network and then place that into a digital environment. I'm watching this cartoon right now, this anime called Pantheon. Golly, this thing is crazy. You guys should check it out. The first season, I think, is on Netflix. And basically, it's like, instead of there being AIs, they have UIs, which are uploaded intelligences, which were like living people who they like they just laser scan their entire brain, and the laser scan destroys the brain. They laser scan your entire brain, and then they just upload you digitally. And then once these people are uploaded, it's like they're still people, and they're having to like live in this completely different environment and then interact with their people who are still in this environment. And so like basically the makers of and the engineers of our technologies have basically said the religious cosmos does not exist. The immortality of the soul, the invisible, it does not exist. What exists is this world. But that craving that we have for that world, we can fulfill that craving through these means. And so to me, that's the other question is like, how do we live a good life according to our historical spiritual traditions? But also like, it doesn't have to be a conflict, but it is this conflict between the religious visions or spiritual visions of humanity being more than just the physical. And then this sort of technological idea that like, you don't have a soul, you don't have a real subjectivity, and it can be replicated. And that's the path.
Yeah.
Yeah. It really reminds me also of another show, Altered Carbon, where it's a similar thing where you basically are able to upload your consciousness mind and then
I got to see it.
Insert it into a new sleeve. And there's a whole class thing where the rich get richer. So then if they're able to live forever, they really get just ridiculously rich.
I can't even handle it, man.
It's a great show.
I got to watch it as a cartoon. I can't even handle it. It's too real. I watch it and I'm like, oh.
It's definitely dystopian and a little scary. But I think you're also speaking to the kind of arrogance of a scientific materialism that erases the kind of religious or mythical, mystical, magical realities that is actually not playing by its own rules. In a lot of ways, that kind of arrogance is bad science because it's not investigating the very real phenomenon, medicine, men and different people, saints performing miracles. Like a lot of the stories are just stories. And there's a lot of things that happen that science can't explain. And so I think a real scientific method would be, how is this possible? How are people being guided to very particular things, these means of finding water through intuition, through prayer that have verifiable results? And then different things like more like astral travel and, reports at least of people coming back with objects from different dimensions, or like in Tibetan Buddhism, the whole Terma tradition of being guided through vision to scrolls that are hidden behind a waterfall and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
All this phenomenon that can't be explained away by science. And so it goes back to the question you're raising, like, what is real and what is kind of just psychological in religious or spiritual traditions? And I think from our perspective and with our knowledge, I think it's a lot of both and. Like there's a lot in it that's just good psychology. Like a lot of prayer is good psychology, and we know about positive psychology. And if you think, for instance, that a person can heal you through prayer, through ritual, and you really believe in that, then the power of positive thinking and psychological aspects of it completely outside of magic could potentially have healing effects. And I've personally spoken to people who've received magical healings, through prayer and stuff, where crazy things happen to them. I was hearing the story one time of a woman who was born, or as she developed, one of her legs was a few inches shorter than the other leg. And so she had incredible hip pain. And this pastor did a kind of like exorcism prayer on her, and she felt a pop in her leg. And from that day forward, her leg was the same length as the other one, and she didn't have any more pain. There's things like that that have verifiable results that can't be explained away by it's just psychology or it's just wish fulfillment thinking. So I think we really need to just complexify our view. I think the psychological and the scientific materialism can help refine those kinds of religious beliefs and spiritual beliefs, the kind of modern bias is to think, oh, this is just a way of explaining that which is unexplainable. But now we have science and technology to explain it or to do those things for us. So we don't need that. But I think we really need to hold a more complex kind of both and viewpoint and really investigate what is phenomenon and what is reality. And when you're talking about the seen and the unseen, how much do we as modern people actively, A, believe that there is an unseen world to interact with, and B, how much do we actually attempt to have those kinds of communications or to see those things? Like if we don't believe and look for the spirit world, for example, it's unlikely that we will have those kinds of experiences or be able to have those kinds of communications. And I guess the last thing, though, what you were saying brought up for me, Ramon, is this idea that to be a kind of true human or to live a good human life, we need to interact as this kind of median between the seen and the unseen, even the dead and the living, like being a steward for our ancestors and all these different ideas where basically in manifestation in human bodies, we're able to interact with the unseen world, and how there's this idea that we're not born necessarily with those capacities, and that to become truly human, we need to be initiated into and taught how to do those things. And that it's not until we've gone through that initiation that we kind of deserve to be called human.
Yeah. I think, too, to come back to something we were saying earlier, like there's this strong implied dualism between spirituality and science, and I think it's mostly illusory, because I think you see the same problematic mind on the spirituality side as you see on the science side. Mm-hmm. So, there's science, which I greatly admire, and then I think there's something that I call scientism, which participates in this problematic mind. When I tell somebody an experience that I've had, which is personal, and maybe I don't understand it. Maybe something came in a dream that related to something outside the dream, and it's like inexplicable to me that I had a dream that had reference to something in life that seemed magical. Say I tell that to somebody who considers themselves a scientist, and then they say, well, that's just. As soon as they did that's just, I don't think they were doing science. I think they were doing scientism. That's not a scientific statement. That's a reductive materialist statement. And I think you have reductive materialists on the scientism side, and I think you have reductive spiritualists on the mysticism side. People that say, well, that was the angel Metatron coming to me and doing this, because on that side, you don't know that anymore.
Yeah.
There's a kind of holy ignorance, a sacred mystery about life where I can't deny experiences I've had, but it's also wrong to attribute too much knowing to them. And it's also wrong to dismiss them as just for somebody else or for yourself. It's just like, no, it was there. It's a fact of my experience, even if it's not a fact, in the external universe. And so I think, there's a disease of mind that reduces, and it reduces one way on the spirituality side, it reduces another way on the so-called science side. But if you take that away, there's not a great deal of difference between the science and the mysticism. You take away that mindset of it is this or it's just that. Mm-hmm. And then you got a holy mystery. You got a sacred experience of life where everything of interest is in the exploration of the, the terra incognita, the unexplored territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's where you have scientists like Albert Einstein that touch the mystery that you could totally describe as mystical, because through a true kind of scientific exploration, they're exploring the mystery. And what are mystics doing but exploring the mystery as well through different tools and means?
This starts to get me to, I feel like there's certain themes I'm seeing here that could be useful in the workshop or in the class, how can we engage in thinking and in models of thinking that go beyond the binary of it's either science or it's definitely this or it's only that. Like, how can we start to engage in ways of thinking and frameworks that are more complex than that?
Mm-hmm.
It also seems to me like maybe even finding biographies, models, practices that come from individuals who or groups that were able to do, say, what Einstein was doing. He worked with equations as contemplative forms. You know what I mean? Like that might be another one. I feel like, and this is something I heard you say in the very beginning of the tunnel about media, given that so much of our interaction with technology is coming through media and that the medias keep going through so many transformations and that they're predicted to go through a lot more in these next few years. I feel like that's another way that we could orient this class is like maybe what kinds of practices might help us meet these shifts in our environment and these shifts in our sense of identity with open-endedness, with mystery, with groundedness, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because, you know, in the near term, in the next 3 years, I don't think we're going to be on a transhuman thing, but we are going to continue to have a lot of changes and AI assistance and da da da. So it's like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, how do we relate to those in a way? How can these historical practices of consciousness, working with consciousness, help us relate to these changes in our environment in ways that are open ended and that are imbued with a sense of mystery? You know,
Yeah. I think it'll take the form of experiments. A radical futurism course needs labs, just like, your chemistry class had labs. And I think we have to do these experiments with human consciousness and the richness of human experience. I think when we're confident about our human capacity, we'll be less dependent and less desirous to use everything like a crutch for identity. When you're actually confident about, what this being and this body can do and be, I think we'll be less vulnerable to being used by our technologies and we'll use them more skillfully. But I think that it takes the practical experiments of discovering things about yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and then we'll interface differently. We need to come in for a landing.
Yeah, I guess as we're coming in for a landing, maybe a rough landing, but as we're doing so, I just want to give you some space, Ramon, if you have any kind of closing thoughts or summation points on the conversation as a whole. And then on top of that, I'm wondering if you could close us out with a poem or song or prayer of your choice.
oh wow, wasn't prepared for the last one. I don't know. I didn't think about that. Yeah, I guess I feel like usually when people say futurism, the mainstream view is technological change creates societal and human change, and that it's almost necessarily for the better or that it's inevitable.
Mm.
And I think from an Afrofuturist point of view, there is this concern coming from Black folks about liberation. You know,
Mm-hmm.
how do we become liberated from a society that tried to turn us into robots? And how do we create our liberation within it? How do we become liberated from it? And what are all the different levels that liberation operates on? And I think the word liberation is a powerful word in a religious cosmos, in a spiritual cosmos, and in a materialist cosmos. And I think people are now in this place of recognizing their interdependence. You want to be physically, culturally, politically sovereign, free. You want to be able to make your own choices. And you want to be psycho-spiritually free. Like you don't want to be caught up with compulsions or, you know, the worship of false idols or, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like all those kind of things. So it's like, how do we see the physical liberation or the materialist liberation and spiritual liberation as interdependent, not as competing?
Right.
And how have our ancestral traditions already provided us? And I really appreciate this piece you put in there, Daniel, with technologies to practice our internal liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think this is also gets down to this customizability of the world. It's like, what kind of world are we designing? Are we going to just design capitalist class warfare world in the year 25, blah, 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 where the rich just keep like just parasite off of us forever? Is that what we want? Do you want to be parasited off of? Do you want to be a parasite? Like, do you want to be a vampire? Like, is that what you really want? Or can we? Yeah, I mean, and some people say, well, it's kill or be killed. It's eat or be eaten, right? And if and technology is going to make me the bigger eater, like that's the loop that we're in, you know? I'm online yapping with people about this all day. I'm like, the crypto bros, and you're like, chill, like there's a bigger world out there. And I think that's what like Afro-futurisms and ethno-futurisms and spiritual futurisms are trying to bring to this mainstream deterministic future, that it's like, it doesn't just have to be one way. There's actually a whole spectrum of human possibility that we can bring these new technologies into relationship with, right. And we can create the kinds of worlds where the focus is on liberation on all levels. And that doesn't mean that my liberation means I got to oppress you in order to get it, which is, that's your altered carbon scenario, right? Yeah. And you ain't really liberated. You're a slave to being a master,
Right.
Like, right? Yeah, man. So I think that's kind of really what I'm seeing. And also like, how do we bring the historic cultural richness? How do we bring the exploration of consciousness into the spiritual futurism, radical futurism class conversation? And how might this period of history be an opportunity to ask ourselves again fresh questions about what does it mean to be human? And not just what does it mean right now, but what has it meant? And how do we bring that historical, and I say historical, and that's not exactly the right word, but how do we bring that historical awareness of what it has meant into relationship with this new environment that's asking us again freshly what it could mean? And then as far as closing prayers or what have you,
Me, we.
Yeah, there you go. There we go. Me, we. Me, we. Yeah.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Shout out to friend of the show, Tree Fort of Golden Turtle Sound, for producing the intro and outro music and assisting with mixing and mastering. Be sure to check out his awesome music and hit up Golden Turtle Sound for any of your audio engineering needs.